Have you ever felt misunderstood, underestimated, or invisible, even when you knew you carried a quiet strength within you? Imagine soaring through the vast, endless sky, a place that embodies freedom, only to be met by the judgmental eyes of those who see only what's on the surface. What if one name whispered through the airwaves could silence an entire sky, revealing the true weight of a legacy built not on power, but on profound courage and unwavering spirit? Stay with us for a story where the very air remembers every brave choice, and a quiet legend shows us that true authority isn't found in the machines we fly, but in the heart that guides them. The name they were about to hear. Her hand hovered over the radio switch. The albatross purred beneath her, a faithful bird she'd rebuilt with her own hands. Lena's eyes narrowed as she watched the F-22s box her in, one slipping neatly behind her to cut off any easy escape, another maintaining altitude on her starboard. Every move they made was textbook perfect, which only made the faint, wry smile tugging at her lips deepen. She'd flown this intercept profile herself so many times, years ago, when she still wore the uniform. Back then, she'd been the hunter, not the one caught in the crosshairs. The lead pilot spoke again, his voice firm but not yet hostile, young enough to betray just a hint of inexperience. Unidentified civilian aircraft, this is Viper Lead. You are ordered to change heading to 270 and descend to flight level 150. Comply immediately or we will escort you to the nearest airfield. For a beat, she said nothing. Only the low hum of the L-39's engines filled the cockpit as Lena looked down at her instruments, confirming what she already knew. Her flight path was technically in violation, but only by a few miles. A bureaucratic error, a paper map that hadn't kept up with the classified expansion of restricted zones. Their mistake, not hers. Yet now they were treating her like some reckless joyrider. She finally reached forward, pressing the transmit button. Viper Lead, this is civilian aircraft, November 312 Lima. Roger your position check. Her voice was calm, even, almost casual. I am aware of my altitude and heading. I will correct momentarily. Copy. There was a pause on the other end. Negative, November 312 Lima, came the reply, sharper now. You are to comply immediately, change heading to 270 and descend now. The arrogance in his tone made her chuckle softly. She imagined the young pilot sitting there in his gleaming Raptor, certain he owned the sky. She keyed the mic again. Copy that, Viper Lead. But before you push this further, you might want to confirm who you're talking to. Falcon Ghost out. Her words floated through the frequency like a thunderclap in clear skies. In the next instant, an eerie silence descended. The three Raptors held their formation, but none spoke. Even the youngest and most impulsive of them must have recognized the name. Falcon Ghost. Lena could almost hear the sudden intake of breath on the other side of the comms, could picture them glancing at one another in their cockpits as though trying to confirm with a look what their ears had just heard. For years, her name had been nothing but a hushed legend among pilots, spoken in briefings and barracks as a cautionary tale, a story of impossible skill and quiet heroism. She hadn't asked for the fame. In fact, she'd run from it. But here it was, returning to her in the form of three dumbfounded Raptors floating at her wing. The silence dragged on so long that she finally flipped the radio again. Viper Lead, she said, her tone cool but with a faint edge of amusement. Are you going to keep me waiting, or shall we clear this up so you boys can get back to doing whatever it is you do up here? Finally, a different voice came over the frequency, older, gruffer, not the lead anymore, probably the squadron commander cutting in from somewhere further back. Copy, Falcon Ghost, he said. Even through the static, she could hear the respect there now, and a little fear. We'll adjust our vectors and leave you to your flight. Apologies for the interruption. That's better, Lena replied evenly. One by one the Raptors peeled away, the shimmer of their stealth-coated wings flashing once as they banked east and climbed back to their patrol altitude. Lena watched them go, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The sky belonged to her again. She leaned back in her seat, feeling the quiet settle over her cockpit once more. Her hand lingered on the throttle, eyes fixed on the endless blue ahead. She wasn't angry, not even rattled. She'd long ago learned the sky was full of ghosts, some of them hers. And out here at 30,000 feet, those ghosts still knew her name. With a faint smile, Lena reached for the music switch and let the familiar chords fill the cabin again as the clouds rolled on beneath her. She had once stood exactly where they stood now, young, brash, utterly convinced that the right training, the right technology, and an iron will made her untouchable. Back then, she'd believed nothing could bring her down. But time and the endless sky had taught her otherwise, as it eventually taught everyone. The sky humbled you sooner or later, and today she would be the one to humble them. Lena's fingers hovered over the microphone. She didn't press it yet. Not yet. Better to let the tension stretch to its breaking point, because the most effective lessons were always the ones you never saw coming. The radio hissed to life, a cocky young voice slicing through the static, a young F-22 pilot, barely able to keep his laughter out of his tone. "Looks like Grandma's playing Top Gun today." Lena didn't dignify it with a reply. She only shook her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Same cocky attitude, same childish swagger. Some things never seem to change in this world of fighters and steel wings. Then another voice broke in over the emergency frequency, deeper and more serious, but just as patronizing. "Unidentified civilian aircraft. This is the United States Air Force. Reduce altitude and change heading immediately. Failure to comply will result in force being used against you." On the heads-up displays inside the F-22 cockpits, bright red targeting brackets locked around Lena's L-39 trainer. The steady, high-pitched beeping of their systems tracking her lit up their ears like mechanical heartbeats, counting down to whatever came next. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, callsign Viper, keyed his internal comm to his wingman, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Can you believe this? Some weekend warrior thinks she can just stroll through restricted airspace like she owns it." Viper 2 chuckled in reply, a lazy contempt in her tone. "She probably bought that old trainer at a surplus auction. You know how it is, watch a few movies, think you're some kind of fighter jock." Jake Morrison smirked behind his oxygen mask and flipped back to the main intercept frequency, his voice now mocking. "Ma'am, I don't know what kind of Top Gun fantasy you're living out, but this isn't a playground. You're about to find out why amateurs don't belong up here with the big boys." A third pilot, Viper 3, couldn't resist adding his own barb. "That old albatross should be hanging in a museum. I don't even know how she's keeping up at this altitude." Every word hit Lena's ears, and though her jaw tightened slightly, her face stayed composed. She'd heard it all before. In her early days in uniform, back when female pilots were still seen as novelties. On deployment after deployment, when even her comrades questioned whether she belonged in a cockpit. And again, after that classified mission, the one that had turned her into a quiet legend among the few who knew the truth. But none of these kids knew any of that. All they saw was what their shallow experience let them see, an aging civilian plane, flown by a woman they assumed was just another wannabe. They didn't know this grandma had racked up more combat hours than their whole squadron put together, that she'd written the very playbook they were still struggling to memorize in flight school, that some of the maneuvers and techniques etched into their manuals had been born in the heat of her real-world dogfights. The irony almost made her laugh, almost. Morrison's voice came back, this time edged with impatience. "Civilian aircraft, this is your final warning. You've got 10 seconds to comply, or we'll escort you down the hard way." All three Raptors had her locked tight. Their fingers hovered over weapon release switches they didn't actually intend to use, but the pressure of knowing they could was all part of the game. Lena's eyes drifted to the lead Raptor through her canopy. She could just make out his helmet glinting in the sun. Some hotshot, fresh out of advanced training, strapped into a jet that cost more than some countries' defense budgets. She remembered being that young, that certain of her own supremacy, that unwilling to believe anyone flying something older or stranger could possibly be a threat. She waited, letting the moment stretch, letting them stew in their certainty. Only when she felt the tension in the air coil to its peak, when they were sure of their dominance over this strange, lone civilian intruder, did she finally press the mic switch. Her voice, when it came through their headsets, was calm, steady, completely free of fear or apology. It was the voice of someone who belonged up here. Viper Flight, this is Captain Petrova. Call sign, Falcon Ghost. And just like that, the frequency went dead quiet. The rhythmic beeping of the target acquisition systems abruptly went dead, as though an unseen hand had cut the power to every aircraft in the formation at once. The cockpit of Lieutenant Jake Morrison, once filled with his usual confidence, felt suddenly colder, heavier. His trademark smirk dissolved into a tight, uneasy line. His fingers trembled ever so slightly on the stick as the meaning of that call sign sank in, hitting him in the gut like a solid punch. Wait, did she just say? His voice cracked when he finally keyed his mic, struggling to keep his composure. Falcon Ghost? His words hung in the tense silence, disbelief lacing each syllable. Falcon Ghost? Like the Falcon Ghost? The one from the stories? Even Viper, too, usually unflappable, barely managed to whisper her own reply. That's impossible. Falcon Ghost is just a legend. From the back of the formation, Viper 3's voice rose, quiet but certain, as though recalling something he'd only half believed himself. The ghost saved an entire squadron during, what was it called? He hesitated, grasping for the name. Operation Nighthawk, came the answer, almost reverent, breathed out into the comms like a prayer. But that mission was classified. How did they even know about it? Morrison remembered his own flight instructor back in advanced training, the way the man had leaned in conspiratorially one late night and whispered the tale, never loudly, never officially. Never. Really? Morrison had asked back then, young and skeptical. Because officially, it had never happened. The legend went like this. One pilot, hopelessly outnumbered, using tactics so brilliant, flying so impossibly precise, that it had changed forever what anyone thought was possible in a dogfight. One pilot who turned certain defeat into a victory so dazzling it was spoken to about in hushed tones decades later. A pilot whose maneuvers were still taught in advanced flight school, though her name never once appeared in a textbook, never in an official briefing. A pilot whose call sign alone had become shorthand for the impossible. And now, here she was, flying that battered old L-39 Albatross alone, 30,000 feet above the earth, as though it were just another quiet afternoon in the sky. The command frequency barked suddenly to life, Morrison's squadron leader's voice sharper than usual. And was that panic he heard under the authority? All Viper units disengage immediately. Repeat, disengage and maintain respectful distance. The three F-22 Raptors, which only moments ago had been ready to force down what they'd all assumed was some overconfident amateur in a museum piece of a jet, suddenly shifted, almost sheepishly, into an escort formation. No shots fired, no aggressive turns, nothing but silence, in a single name that carried more weight than the entire squadron's combined firepower. Because in the sky, some names held more power than missiles or machine guns. What meant more? The roar of a modern formation or a legend, whispered with respect across generations? The silence stretched impossibly long, 30 seconds, maybe more, an eternity in the cockpit. Then the commander's voice cut in again, louder this time. His words clipped and urgent. All Viper units, this is control. Stand down immediately. Repeat, stand down and maintain escort formation. Morrison's voice was unsteady when he finally spoke up. Sir, can you confirm, is that really the actual Falcon Ghost? There was a pause before control replied. Affirmative, Viper Lead. You are in the presence of a living legend. Act accordingly. The words made Morrison's blood run cold. His world tilted just a little. Every pilot he knew had heard scraps of her story, passed on in the quiet corners of ready rooms, murmured late at night over coffee, or whispered during long deployments when young officers needed to believe that impossible didn't mean hopeless. But no one ever saw anything official. Those records were buried so deep behind classification walls that most of them assumed the whole thing was just another myth to keep rookies motivated. Yet here she was, real. Control's voice came back, now addressing her directly. Falcon Ghost, this is Grey Rock Control. We apologize for the intercept. Your flight plan update didn't reach our sector in time. You are cleared to continue on your current heading with full honors escort. Her reply was immediate, calm, and professional, but carrying a quiet finality that made Morrison sit up straighter. Negative control, no escort necessary. I can handle myself up here. Of course she could, but curiosity gnawed at Morrison, shoving his embarrassment aside. Without thinking too hard, he switched to a private frequency, a quiet channel usually reserved for pilot-to-pilot chatter during training flights. Ma'am, Captain Petrova, this is Lieutenant Morrison. He hesitated just a moment before adding, I owe you an apology for what I said earlier. It was out of line. Her laugh was faint, dry but not unkind. Apology accepted, Lieutenant. We've all been young and stupid at altitude. He almost smiled at that, but the question he'd been holding on to tumbled out before he could stop it. Ma'am, if I may, Operation Nighthawk. Is it true, what they say you did? The line went quiet for a long moment, longer than felt comfortable. He sat in his cockpit, waiting, hands gripping the controls just a little too tight, listening to nothing but the faint hum of his own engines and the static on the line. She rarely spoke of that mission, even to those cleared to know it had happened. Something in the young pilot's voice, an honest, almost awestruck curiosity wrapped in newfound respect, made her pause, reconsider. What exactly do they say, Lieutenant? She asked, her tone calm but edged with something harder to name. Morrison darted a glance at his wingman, loosely spaced around them now, silent but clearly listening on the open channel. He took a breath. They say, he began, steady and clear, you saved an entire squadron when you were outnumbered 12-1. That you pulled tactics no one had ever seen before. That you turned what should have been a massacre into such a decisive victory the enemy never recovered from it. Lena said nothing, her hands resting steady on the controls, but she could hear her own heart beating louder with every word. Morrison continued, and what else do they say? They say you did it flying a plane that was already obsolete before the mission even began. That you were wounded early on but stayed in the fight for 40 minutes. That you... He hesitated for the first time. His voice dropped, as though even saying it aloud carried a weight. That you saved 68 American lives that day. Her fingers curled just slightly on the stick. 68, the number was correct. She had never forgotten it. 68 pilots and crew who'd gotten to go home to their families because of choices she'd made in the span of 40 harrowing minutes. The details are classified, Lieutenant, she said at last, her voice even but quieter now. But I will tell you this. When you're up against impossible odds, technology won't save you. Training helps, but it's not enough. What saves you is forcing the enemy to fight your fight, not theirs. From her right flank, Captain Sarah Chen chimed in, her tone sharp with curiosity. Ma'am, how do you make an enemy fight your fight when they outnumber you 12-1? You make them think, Lena replied without hesitation, that they're fighting 12 of you, instead of one of them. The silence that followed was thick, the simplicity of her answer hanging in the air like contrails in a cold blue sky. Morrison felt the weight of it immediately. He'd studied air combat tactics extensively. He knew what she was talking about wasn't just audacious, it bordered on suicidal. The Phantom Squadron technique, he murmured under his breath. You spoofed their radar, made them believe they were facing an entire wing instead of a single fighter. Lena's quiet confirmation crackled through the comms, among other things. But that's not the real lesson here, Lieutenant. The real lesson isn't about tactics. It's about understanding that superiority doesn't come from having the best equipment. It comes from having the clearest purpose. Control's voice cut in, breaking the spell of her words. Falcon Ghost, we're showing 3 additional aircraft inbound, requesting permission to join your escort. Word seems to have spread about who's flying in our airspace today. Through her canopy, Lena spotted them closing in, 2 gleaming F-35 Lightning IIs, and farther behind, the unmistakable silhouette of an older F-16 Fighting Falcon. Pilots from other squadrons, almost certainly veterans who'd heard her call sign on the net and wanted to share the sky, if only for a moment, with a legend they'd never expected to meet. Tell them thanks, but no, she replied evenly. I prefer flying alone. But Morrison's voice came back almost immediately. Ma'am, with respect, you're not alone up here. Not anymore. And he was right. Without any formal orders, without even a chain of command, the other aircraft had fallen into place around her, forming something new, something she hadn't seen before. An impromptu honor guard, born of nothing but quiet reverence for a pilot whose deeds had never been publicly acknowledged. The F-22s held formation with her aging L-39 perfectly, not as predators, but as protectors now. The F-35s slipped into flanking positions, their pilots silent but steady, their presence solid. Even the old F-16 kept station with crisp, almost ceremonial precision, likely flown by a man who'd been in uniform back when she was still on active duty. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried an emotion she almost never allowed to show. Control, inform all aircraft, Falcon Ghost is honored by their escort, but it isn't necessary. And the reply that came wasn't from control, but from a new voice on the frequency, older, rougher, with the gravel of long years and long flights. Probably the F-16 pilot. With all due respect, ma'am, it is necessary. Some of us have been waiting 10 years for the chance to fly with you. Today might be our only shot. Morrison felt his throat tighten as the words sank in. He understood exactly what the man meant. Lena Petrova was more than just a call sign. She was a bridge between eras, between the hard early days of women in combat aviation and the generation who now took her trailblazing for granted. Her story was stitched into military history, but only in whispers, only in classified reports. Finally, Lena let out a breath. "Very well," she said at last. Then a faint wry smile crept into her voice. "But I set the pace, and the altitude. And gentlemen," her L-39 banked smoothly into a climb, engines roaring. "Try to keep up." The obsolete trainer sat there on the tarmac, surrounded on all sides by the most advanced fighter jets humankind had ever designed. By every logical measure, it should have looked laughable, a relic dwarfed by sleek, modern machines bristling with technology. And yet, somehow, it looked exactly right. The legend at the center of it all, right where she belonged, lending her presence to the future of military aviation as if they could learn simply by flying beside her. At 35,000 feet, their formation was flawless, cutting through the upper air like a single blade. Lieutenant Jake Morrison stole a glance at her cockpit and felt the full weight of what he was part of sink in. This wasn't just another sortie. This was the kind of moment that would define his entire career. He wasn't just flying with Falcon Ghost. He was flying alongside history itself. When Lena's battered L-39 finally touched down on the civilian airfield, word of what had happened above spread through the military's quiet channels like wildfire. Within hours, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Old squadron mates, former commanders, young pilots she'd once mentored, names she hadn't heard in years reaching out just to say they'd heard. And then came the call that stood out from the rest. The base commander at Grey Rock Air Force Base, Colonel Patricia Hayes herself. Her voice was formal but warm. "Captain Petrova, it would be an honor to have you come address our pilot training program. These young aviators need to hear from someone who's actually been there." 2 days later, Lena stood at the front of a briefing room filled with eager faces. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Morrison, the same brash young lieutenant who'd once called her grandma in the sky, now sat in the front row, leaning forward with genuine curiosity that had replaced his earlier arrogance. She surveyed them all for a moment, letting the silence stretch, before she asked evenly, "Who here can tell me the difference between flying and combat flying?" Morrison's hand shot up. "Ma'am," he said, his tone steady this time, "combat flying is applying training under enemy fire." She nodded slightly, but her eyes narrowed. "Partly correct," she replied, pacing a little, her hand gesturing toward the tactical displays projected behind her. "But here's the thing. Training assumes predictable scenarios. Combat throws the rulebook right out the canopy. Nothing is ever just like it was in training." She stopped and leveled her gaze at them all. "When I faced 12 hostile aircraft during Operation Nighthawk, no amount of training had prepared me for what actually happened up there." A young female pilot near the back raised her voice timidly. "Ma'am, how did you know which rules to break?" A faint smile tugged at Lena's mouth. "You don't break rules, Lieutenant," she said softly. "You transcend them. There's a difference. And it's everything. Chaos gets you killed. Improvisation keeps you alive long enough to find a solution. Don't confuse the two." From the side, Captain Sarah Chen, Morrison's intercept teammate, raised a question of her own. Ma'am, the Phantom Squadron technique. Can that actually be taught? The maneuver itself can be taught, Lena answered, her voice sharper now. But the judgment to know when to use it, that comes from experience, from understanding that sometimes the word impossible just means untested. The rest of the session flowed on like that, Lena sharing insight after insight, things no manual could ever capture. These weren't just tactical lessons. They were something deeper. Principles about thinking under pressure, about finding opportunity hidden in crisis, about refusing to surrender to fear when everything seems lost. When it was over and the trainees began filing out, Morrison lingered. He finally approached her, shoulders squared but a hint of nerves in his eyes. Ma'am, he began, his voice lower now. I wanted to apologize again for what I said to you during the intercept. She studied him for a moment before answering. Lieutenant, she said not unkindly, you saw an old aircraft and made assumptions. That's human nature. But remember this, up there, experience often matters more than technology. Chen stepped over, joining them with an easy grin. Ma'am, she asked, will you be flying through our airspace again soon? Lena gave her a faint smile. I fly where the sky takes me, Captain. But I have a feeling our paths will cross again. That evening, the base held an informal gathering in one of the hangars. Lena found herself surrounded by 3 generations of military aviators, grizzled veterans who remembered her from her active service days, current pilots who knew her by her reputation alone, and wide-eyed young cadets just beginning to understand what her call sign really meant. At some point, Colonel Hayes stood up and raised her glass, her voice carrying easily over the chatter. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, today we were reminded of something important. Legends aren't just stories. Sometimes they're people. People who share our sky, who share our dedication to something larger than ourselves. She glanced at Lena, her eyes warm but full of respect. Here's to Falcon Ghost, to the techniques we study, the principles we follow, and the example that reminds us all. The sky belongs to those brave enough to claim it. The toast rippled through the room in a chorus of raised glasses and quiet murmurs. But Lena noticed something subtle, something that meant more to her than all the words. The way the younger pilots were looking at her now, not with wide-eyed hero worship, but with the kind of professional respect she valued most. They saw her for what she truly was, a pilot who'd faced impossible odds and found a way through. As the evening wound down, Lena slipped outside, leaving the noise behind. She tilted her face up toward the stars, the same endless sky that had borne silent witness to her most legendary mission. It stretched out above her, vast and indifferent, waiting for whoever dared to reach for it next. 6 months had passed since that day at 30,000 feet, and Lena Petrova stood once more beneath an open sky, this time not as Falcon Ghost, the living legend, but as Lena Petrova, the pilot, the woman behind the name. In her heart, the echoes of that impossible mission still resounded. Secrets and stories that no one would ever fully know, sacrifices too quiet to ever be written down. Tomorrow she would fly again, as she always had, not for glory, but for the quiet traditions that kept her and her kind alive in the sky. The sky remembered everything. And now she hoped a new generation would remember too. 6 months later, she stood before a graduating class of advanced fighter pilots at the Air Force Academy. They were young, eager, and shining with ambition, and she felt herself smiling faintly at how much she saw herself in them. Behind her on the stage hung a large photograph of her old L-39 Albatross, caught in perfect formation with a flight of F-22 Raptors from that unforgettable day. She let her gaze sweep across the room before she spoke. Who can tell me what makes a call sign legendary? A dozen hands shot up, but she pointed to one cadet in the front row. He was confident, his shoulders squared, his voice steady. Ma'am, he said, exceptional flying skills and combat victories. Lena shook her head slowly, almost sadly, and the room grew quiet again. That, she said evenly, is what makes a pilot competent. But a legendary call sign? That comes from something much deeper. She began walking toward the tall window at the side of the hall, and the cadets' heads followed her as she moved. Outside, sleek F-35s and F-22s gleamed on the flight line, even a few older trainers like her L-39 standing stubbornly among them. She gestured to them as she spoke. In this modern world, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, where radar and algorithms and computer-assisted targeting dominate, there are still names that make entire formations fall silent when spoken. Not because of the aircraft they flew, but because of the principles they stood for. She let the silence stretch for a moment before she turned back to them. 6 months ago, she continued, her eyes hard but her smile faint, I was dismissed by pilots half my age, flying machines more expensive than some nations' defense budgets. They called me Grandma playing Top Gun. A few cadets chuckled nervously, but her tone silenced them again. And yet, when I said my call sign aloud, those same pilots straightened their backs and became an honor guard. Not for me, but for what the name stood for. She paused in front of them now, and they could see the weight of decades in her face and the fire still in her eyes. A call sign is more than just an identifier, she told them. It's a reputation condensed into 2 words. It's every decision you made when no one was watching, every risk you took when the odds were impossible, every life you fought to save, distilled into something that will define you long after you've flown your last sortie. In the back row, a young female cadet spoke up hesitantly. Ma'am, how do we earn a call sign that commands that kind of respect? Lena's eyes softened as she answered. You don't earn it by trying to earn it, she said simply. You earn it by forgetting it exists, by focusing on the mission and nothing else, by choosing principle over convenience, courage over comfort. She turned slightly and gestured to the photograph hanging behind her. Her little albatross, dwarfed by the Raptors, but flying as their equal. That day, she said quietly, those F-22 pilots didn't salute my aircraft. They saluted what my call sign meant to them, the willingness to face impossible odds because lives depended on it. When the ceremony concluded and the cadets filed out, a young lieutenant lingered behind. He waited until the others were gone before approaching her, his hands behind his back. Ma'am, he said, a little uncertain, do you think call signs will still matter when everything becomes automated, when it's all AI flying the missions? Lena regarded him for a long moment before answering, her voice calm but resolute. Lieutenant, she said, technology changes, aircraft evolve, but the sky will always need pilots who understand that the most advanced computer in any cockpit is the human heart. That evening, she strapped herself back into her L-39 for the flight home. The cockpit was familiar, comforting, and she felt the quiet hum of the engines beneath her boots. As she taxied past rows of gleaming fighters, F-22s, F-35s, she keyed her mic to the tower and spoke softly, almost to herself. This is Falcon Ghost, she said, requesting clearance for departure. Falcon Ghost, came the reply, a gruff but respectful voice. You are cleared for takeoff. Safe skies, ma'am. As the albatross lifted off into the fading sunset, Lena felt the weight of the years settle into something lighter, something almost like peace. She knew now more than ever what she had learned over decades at altitude. Legends weren't created by the machines they flew or the technology they mastered. Legends were forged in the quiet choices made when everything was on the line, when someone decided to be more than the sum of their equipment. Above her, the stars were just beginning to pierce the twilight, and she climbed toward them, her voice low but firm. The skies may change, she said to herself. The legends never do. Some call signs faded with time, she knew. Others became eternal, whispered with respect across generations of aviators who understood that true authority didn't come from rank or circuitry, but from the courage to live up to the name they carried. And the sky remembered everything. Every brave decision, every impossible mission, every quiet legacy still owning the skies.